What? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sorry for the interruption. So now the dhanna akhatuha, the basis have three states broadly, right? Because the basis is that they do their amal, and this the grammarians refer to as i'mal, right? Which is, and dhanna and akhawatuha, whether the af'al al-qalb, the 14, or the af'al al-tasir, which are how many? There's 5, right? All of them, the basis is that they behave in this way, in this chapter, right? Which is i'mal, that they have this amal, right? Nasb of the mubtada and the khabar, right? The second is called ilgha. Ilgha, which is ibtalul amal, that they don't no longer behave in this way, both in wording and in meaning, lafdhan wa mahallan, right? And basically, there are two reasons why dhanna and akhawatuha have ilgha, that the grammarians mention in this context, which is either due to the basic reason is the amil becomes weak. Like dhanna and akhawatuha become weak because of either something comes between dhanna and akhawatuha and what comes after, or because dhanna and akhawatuha themselves come after what they're supposed to act upon. So for example, you say Zaydun dhanantu qa'imun. Just to give an example, we'll look at the chapter, right? So here what happened? It will be dhanantu Zaydan qa'iman. But if you say Zaydun dhanantu, qa'imun, this would be mubtada khabar, right? Zaydun qa'imun. And we'll see what the i'rab is, right? This is called ilgha. And there are rules of ilgha, right? So one case is they act, the other is that they don't, and that's basically because the function of dhanna and akhawatuha here becomes weakened, right? Either because the amil comes, because they come after the amil, or and for other reasons we'll see. And the third case of dhanna and akhawatuha, so the basis is i'mal, ilgha. The third is ta'liq. Ta'liq is that ibtalul amal lafdhan la mahallan. That in the case of ta'liq, that something happens, so outwardly they're not acting. Right? Outwardly they're not acting, but it's fi mahal, its grammatical place though is kada wa kada, as we'll see. And there's various reasons, we'll get into them. Amongst them, for example, is if lamul ibtida comes in. So you say dhanantu Zaydan qa'iman, but if you say dhanantu لَزَيْدٌ قَائِمٌ. This is called لام الابتداء. And we'll look at that. For example, and there's multiple cases. These are in the chapter. But, and there are cases of this, right? This is where tashjir helps so much, right? Tashjir helps so much, right? And then after that, there are rules related to dhanna and akhawata. So basically, in the diagramming, there's af'al al-qulub, there's af'al al-tasir under dhanna and akhawatuha. Broadly, they have three states. I'mal, ilgha, which is that it does not, it just stops acting. Or ta'liq, which is where it, lafzan, it's not putting things in nasb, but mahallan, it's in nasb, right? And then as is usual, he mentioned some of the ahkam mentioned to it, and then there's a tanbih in the end, that there's the author of the Ajrumiyya fell into a khilaf, right? And this, of course, raises a speculation amongst the grammarians as to what was Ibn Ajurrum Kufan in the madhab of grammar, or was he influenced by the Kufans? And we don't know. But there are influences, but why was he influenced? Because he's like way after the whole Kufan Basran divide. One of the reasons that happens sometimes that affects a scholar is they became deeply influenced by a book or an author, right? And they found great benefit in it. So you see the traces of that in everything that they do. Right? So for example, amongst the later Hanafi school, in Hanafi fiqh, you find the Ibn al-Humam, that's what they call al-Muhaqqiq, that pretty much everyone who comes after Ibn al-Humam is deeply dependent on him as to the textual and legal reasoning of the madhab. And frequently you see what are the hadiths that are quoted by Ibrahim al-Halabi and others. It goes back to, they took Fath al-Qadir as their go-to. Right? Similarly, sometimes the influence is clear, sometimes it'll be less obvious. But so the author of the Ajrumiyya considered amongst the af'al, amongst dhanna and akhawatuha, sami'tu. And if you revise the chapter mentally, he includes sami'tu, right? Here, if you look at the Mutammima, do you see sami'tu? Not that I can see. Right? Right? And in this, the author of the Ajrumiyya followed al-Akhfash. Right? Right? Because they had a particular understanding of what if you say سمعت زيدا يتكلم, for example, right? Right? سمعنا فتى يذكرهم in the Quran, right? So in that, the Jumhur disagreed. So this is one of the, normally the Mutammima makes the itmam insofar as it adds to the Ajrumiyya. There's a few places where the Mutammima, what's it doing? It's actually editing the Ajrumiyya. That's rare, because we know that, and al-Hattab is a great, if you look at the other writings of al-Hattab, he is a masterful scholar, He leaves the definitions of the Ajrumiyya alone, for example, right? Like he doesn't, it's not tagheerul Ajrumiyya. But this is one of the places where and we'll see what happened according to Jumhur, what does dhanna and akhawatuha do, Okay. النوع فقال صاحب الأجرمية رحمة الله تعالى عليه ونفعنا به وحققنا وبكم وحققنا وإياكم في هذا العلم. النوع الثالث ظن وأخواتها. Right? So these are the النوع الثالث of what? أما ظن وأخواتها فإنها تدخل بعد استيفاء فاعلها على المبتدأ والخبر. Right? 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 So ظن and أخواتها first take a فاعل. Right? Because they're أفعال. So they take a فاعل and then they enter upon the مبتدأ and خبر. Right? What does he say in the Ajrumiyya here? Yeah. Right? So the Ajrumiyya's expression here leaves something hanging. So he makes itmam here, right? Because in the Ajrumiyya it says that ظن أن أخواتها, I think it says ظننت أن أخواتها, right? Right? He doesn't say it explicitly, but he mentions it. How? Indirectly by saying أما ظننت وأخواتها. And I'd be surprised, I believe that there's اختلاف of nusakh, difference of the copies of the Ajrumiyya over here, because some do say ظننت وأخواتها, others just say straight up ظن وأخواتها, right? 330. Sorry. Just can you just find one now? Okay, Bismillah. So he adjusts the expression here, right? So أما ظن أخواتها فتدخل فإنها تدخل بعد استيفاء فاعلها. So they enter upon, enter after taking a فاعل على المبتدأ والخبر. فتنصبهما, and they put both in نصب على أنهما مفعولان لها. On the basis that the mubtada and khabar become maf'ools for them. This already taken a fa'il, and they take, and these behave as a mansoob, right? The body of these are the af'alul qulub, right? So he begins with them. Now, technically, yeah. Where? Yeah. Right? So, yeah, they have ظننت وأخواتها, right? So the اختلاف of nusakh, but there's a really excellent commentary on the Ajrumiyya. One of the really good brief commentaries on the Ajrumiyya, and you guys should do a reading session together on it, right? Aim to finish it before Ramadan. It's very brief. It's basically like a rereading of the Ajrumiyya, right? And include some of the shabab in it, like Jacob and so on, right? It's the Sharh of Zaini Dahlan It's one of the brief shuruh. It's a very mubarak sharh. Right? It doesn't he just, it's like, it's barely bigger than the Ajrumiyya. And there's one of the largest commentaries on the Ajrumiyya, without exception, is bigger than most of the commentaries actually on the Alfiyya. I don't recommend it like for anything at this stage, but it's it's brilliant though. It's called Tashwiq al-Khillan, right? And there's some really nice old copies. So he mentions that, right? Right? So he says that most وجميع النسخ المتن التي شرحها غير الشارح, right? That all the copies of the Ajrumiyya that are commented upon by other than the Sharih mention ظن وأخواتها, right? At the beginning of where it says باب العوامل الداخلة على المبتدأ والخبر, right? And but then under ظن وأخواتها, what does he say? وَأَمَّا ظَنَنْتُ أَخَوَاتُهَا, right? Yeah. So he, so there is this ikhtilaf, and because of Zaini Dahlan's copy, others then bring that into, because normally it's called ظَنَّ وَأَخَوَاتُهَا, right? So when because Ibn Ajrum refers to it as ظَنَّ وَأَخَوَاتُهَا, then he doesn't mention the issue of the after the fa'il. Why? Because in ظَنَنْتُ, where is the fa'il? Yeah. Right? So, but that's not normally what it's referred to, right? And in maqam al-ta'lim, being explicit, especially for a beginner, is more useful, right? So things like that are useful. These nuances are, the practical nuances are useful to incorporate into one's copy of the Ajrumiyya itself, right? Okay. So he says, وَهِيَ نَوْعَانِ, right? أَحَدُهُمَا أفعال القلوب, right? 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 And why are they called أفعال القلوب? Right? Because الفاكهي he says أي أفعال تصدر تتعلق بالقلب وتصدر منه. These are actions that are related to the heart and emerge from the heart. لا عن الجوارح. They're not outward actions. Right? Right? And there's a use, but of course not all the actions of the heart take two maf'uls. Right? 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 So he says there are 14 that not all the actions of the heart behave in this way, right? So أفعال القلوب, these are أفعال القلوب المعهودة, right? That are the ones that do behave in this way, right? And you can see the breakdown of the three types of أفعال القلب in فواكه الجنية. We don't need to go into. وهي ظننت وحسبت وخلت ورأيت وعلمت وزعمت وجعلت وحجوت وعددت وهب ووجدت وألفيت ودريت وتعلم. Right? Right? So these are 14, right? So he gives them to us here, right? One of the good, useful things that Maulana al-Ahdal does, right, is he gives the core meaning of each of these af'al, for example, right? That's a very useful component of so he mentions the 14 first, and we learned just like the author of the Ajrumiyya of the Mahasin is that he has a structured approach to things, right? He mentions the 14 in a structured manner, and almost inevitably there's a logical ordering of how he does it, right? And of course he's building on the efforts of the grammarians before him. And then now he makes, this is laf, like he gathers them together, and then nashr, and then he spreads them. It's called al-laf wa nashr al-murattab, an ordered laf and nashr, right? So he says, نحو ظننت زيدا قائما, such as I thought Zayd was standing, right? So right? ظننت زيدا قائما وحسبت زيدا عالما. Now ظن, Al-Faqih touches upon it briefly. He says والغالب في ظن أنها تفيد رجحان الوقوع وقد ترد what do you have?
كما مثل
وقد ترد لليقين, and sometimes it's used to indicate certainty, right? So dhanna is usually for rujhanul wuqu', right? Like the example, dhanantu, I thought, meaning I was. So it's rujhan, right? And normally it's a positive rujhan. It's a positive preponderation, normally. Either actually, right? Or at least according to the person themselves, right? Or it could be, in some usages, it's used for certitude, right? نحو, like يظنون أنهم ملاقو ربهم, right? And they think, meaning they are certain. يظنون أنهم ملاقو ربهم, right? From Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 46. And hasiba is used in the same way, right? And it also is sometimes used for certitude, right? So now you'll notice in the Mutammima he begins throwing in poetry now, slowly, right? We saw a few examples initially, we barely had that. So وقول الشاعر, right? نحو كذا ونحو قول الشاعر, and like the words of the poet, حسبت التقى والجود خير تجارة, right? I knew that the taqwa, حسبت التقى والجود خير تجارة, right? I حسبت. Now, dhanna is from exercising one's judgment. Hasiba has a thing where, you from hisab, like where you judge something, right? So one has a issue of exercising your, or of the dhann is you considered the possibilities, right? Dhann, you can say, is where there can be considered synonymous, but dhann is very often where you consider the possibilities and the evidence, and this preponderates. Hasiba has the element of judging, estimating, right? That's why from that you have hisab, right? Of that which is calculated, enumerated, right? But both have the meaning of judging, right? Right? So this line of poetry is beautiful. حسبت التقى والجود خير تجارة رباحا إذا ما المرء أصبح ثاقلا. Right? And this is this was stated by Labid. Right? Right? I have deemed mindfulness and taqwa and jood, generosity, the best of trade in profit if a person seeks to be weighty in their scales, right? ثاقلا. Right? And then you have خلت عمرا شاخصا. Right? خلت عمرا شاخصا. Right? Right? And خلت is also used similarly to ظن. It's used for preponderation, right? خلت عمرا شاخصا. Used for either judgment, or it can also be used for Bismillah. It can also be used for like dhanna, for preponderation or for certainty. Right? خلت عمرا شاخصا. وقوله تعالى إنهم يرونه قريبا. Right? Right? إنهم يرونه قريبا. What? Sorry, عفوا. My mistake. Astaghfirullah. إنهم. I was looking at the end of the verse. Astaghfirullah. إنهم يرونه بعيدا ونراه قريبا. Right? إنهم يرونه بعيدا. Right? وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا. Now, رَأَى, when it behaves like ظَنَّ أَخْوَاتُهَا, رَأَى الْغَالِب, that it's for certainty. Right? And sometimes it's for rujhan. Sometimes, so رَأَى is normally for yaqeen and sometimes for rujhan, for preponderation. Right? Right? So, إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا, they see it, meaning they think it to be distant. إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا, they see it as distant, meaning they think, they imagine. Their preponderation is, it's a long time away. وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا أي نَعْلَمُهُ قَرِيبًا. Right? And we know it to be close. Right? The second is for yaqeen. Right? So that's the, right? And the next example is وَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى فَإِنْ عَلِمْتُمُوهُنَّ مُؤْمِنَاتٍ وَزَعَمْتُ زَيْدًا صَدِيقًا. Right? So the first one is فَإِنْ عَلِمْتُمُوهُنَّ مُؤْمِنَاتٍ. Right? So alima behaves like ra'a. Right? Right? It's used for rujhan, for preponderation, and for certitude. Right? فَإِنْ عَلِمْتُمُوهُنَّ مُؤْمِنَاتٍ, if you know them to be believers, the ulama of tafsir differed. That here, is it for certitude, or if you know them, meaning if you think, it's for rujhan. And certainly al-Fakihi says that it's for rujhan in this verse, right? Alima, and this is a discussion. Does ilm indicate certainty as a word? And the usulis differed on that. But a lot of the ulama would say yes, the primary usage of ilm is for yaqeen. It's only secondarily used for dhann. Right? And that's discussed in its due place. And from the examples of ilm behaving, ilm being, having been just know but be certain, is فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Right? So that's, and then you have za'ama, right? Right? So you have alima, you have then za'ama, right? And za'ama only has, the za'ama is used normally only in rujhan, preponderation, right? For example, za'amtu Zaydan Sadiqan. Right? Now this is in some copies of the Mutammima and not in others. Right? Za'amtu Zaydan Sadiqan. It's in some copies, not others. وقول الشاعر. These are really cute lines. زعمتني شيخا ولست بشيخ. The rest of the line is إنما الشيخ من يدب دبيبا. Right? Right? زعمتني شيخا. You imagine me to be a sheikh and I am not a sheikh. إنما الشيخ من يدب دبيبا. The sheikh is only the one who walks with a cane. Is the elderly one. Right? And again, there are some copies of the Mutammima mention the end of the line, others don't. Right? And then there's ja'ala, right? Then you have ja'ala, like the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَجَعَلُوا الْمَلَائِكَةَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ إِنَاثًا. Right? Right? So, جَعَلُوا, right? So, جَعَلَ is أفعال القلب. They made. But of course, they didn't make them. This does not mean physically, right? This is the action of the heart, right? Right? Now, this is where al-Ahdal goes into a little more nuance. Za'ama is often used for a rujhan khilaf al-waqi'. Right? Very often they use it in that sense. And the ulama use this particularly. Right? And this is the example that the author of the Mutammima gives. Za'amtani shaykhan. You imagine me to be a shaykh. But is this a correct supposition? No. And of course, that i'rab, za'amta fa'il, ni is مفعول أول, شيخا مفعول ثاني. Right? Right? ولست بشيخ, and I'm not a sheikh. Right? Because the za'am is a dhann, a rujhan, خلاف الواقع. Frequently. In the Quran, وظن أن لن. Yeah. There's a number of places where it's used. أَلَّن يَبُورْ, right? What is it? The tip of the tongue. Bismillah. Okay. It's so it's used for a supposition that is contrary to reality. What's the... and the fuqaha use it frequently like that, right? وَزَعَمَ so and so. And many of the ulama will read it as is, like in the text of the fuqaha, but the adab, especially with the great imams, right? So someone says, وَزَعَمَ يعني السندي, you say, ثُمَّ قَالَ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ, then he said رحمه الله, because that someone at that level can say za'ama, etc. But the talib ilm should not be someone who speaks in those ways, right? Okay, so that's ja'alu, right? So za'ama and then ja'ala, and then some are less common than others, right? The next is حجى, right? وقول الشاعر قد كنت أحجو أبا عمرو أخا ثقة. أحجو أي أظن. I used to imagine, truly I used to imagine Abu Amr a trusted brother. حتى ألمت بنا يوما ملمات, until one day things happened to us. Right? So it's one of the themes. Your regret and loss are big themes in Arab poetry, right? Okay. So أحجو, and this is rare, right? وقول الآخر, right? And so this is, and then from the examples of ظن أخواتها is عد فلا تعدد المولى شريكك في الغنى, right? 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 لا تعدد, do not deem, do not imagine. المولى شريكك في الغنى. Al-Mawla, of course, is one of those intriguing words in Arabic because it has double meanings, right? Mawla can refer to master, it can also refer to the servant. Do not deem the servant your partner in your wealth, rather deem your servant your partner in your nothingness. Of course, what they mean by Adam is different from what. So Mawla here with the meaning of Al-Abd. Do not deem the servant your partner in wealth, right? Because it's a noble thing that, okay, I have wealth, I share it with my servant. That's good. But that's sort of coming from the wealth is mine and I share it. But rather, deem the servant your partner in nothingness, that he's got nothing and you don't have anything. It's like, that's why the Arabs had some really wise things to say, right? There you can see الشعر ديوان العرب, right? There's a lot of cool things. Okay, Bismillah. And then the next example, وَقَوْلِهِ, right? And this is hab, right? So, and not all of these are Quranic examples. That's why he's resorting to a lot of poetry. Right? So he says, فَهَبْنِي أَمْرًا هَالِكًا. Right? فَهَبْنِي أَمْرًا هَالِكًا. Right? And this is part of a longer point. فَهَبْنِي, so grant me a matter ruinous. فَقُلْتُ أَجِرْنِي أَبَا خَالِدٍ. Right? So I said, free me, O Abu Khalid. Otherwise, grant me a matter destructive. Right? They don't leave me stuck over here. Either free me or grant me, grant me. Ajara is, grant me respite or ruin me or destroy me. They don't leave me hanging. Right? Okay. And then you have wajada, right? Which indicates certainty or yeah, and has secondary meanings as well, right? But a primary meaning of it is, because wajada is to find, right? So the primary meaning is to find, and when you find something, you're sure of it, right? قوله تعالى تجدوه عند الله هو خيرا. Right? From Surah Al-Muzammil, right? Right? And or وجدت الصدق منجيا, as another example given in فاكهة وجدت الصدق منجيا. Right? I found truthfulness to be salvific, right? And the next example, so that's wajada, right? And here, if you have a copy of the Mutammima, you could put in square brackets which verb, even in the which of the dhanna akhawatuha it's going through, and you could number your copy too. These are practical things to be doing, right? And then you have alfa, right? Right? And alfa behaves like wajada, right? Right? That's why they're arranged in a nice logical manner, right? So alfa, نحو قوله تعالى إنهم ألفوا آباءهم ضالين. إنهم ألفوا هم آباءهم منصوب, ضالين منصوب, right? Right? And like it in behavior is dara, right? Which again has the meaning of, daraitu زيدا قائما, right? daraitu زيدا قائما, right? Right? دريت الوفي العهد يا عروة فاغتبط فإن اغتباطا بالوفاء حميد. Right? Right? So here the first part, right? You have the whole. Some copies don't have this line of poetry. Some do. دريت الوفي العهد يا عروة فاغتبط. You have found one who is true of their covenant. فاغتبط أي فاغتنم, make the most of it. Or اغتباط, be satisfied. فإن اغتباط بالوفاء حميد, for satisfaction with wafa, with someone who is trustworthy or loyal is praiseworthy. Right? This is a nice line of poetry as well. Right? And like it is تعلم, like مثل قول الشاعر, like the poet saying, تعلم شفاء النفس قهر عدوها. Learn, تعلم أي أنت شفاء النفس قهر عدوها. Right? Know, you come to know, تعلم, learn. So you say, the مبتدا and khabar was شفاء النفس قهر عدوها. Right? شفاء النفس قهر عدوها. مبتدا خبر. شفاء النفس, the cure for the self is to overcome its enemy. That's a beautiful, wise statement. So تعلم, learn that. تعلم أنت شفاء النفس, the healing of the self is overcoming its enemy. But then this is why there's these beautiful lines of poetry, right? And this is that's why if nothing else, the larger works of grammar introduce you to all kinds of cool poetry, right? Right? And then he says, the rest of the line is فَبَالِغْ بِلُطْفٍ فِي التَّحَيُّلِ وَالْمَكْرِ. So, بالغ, take all the means in gentleness. فِي التَّحَيُّلِ, in your tricks and in your deception of your lower self, right? Of your enemies. Well, the enemies that we know that are four, right? It's really cool, right? So now he's finished the 14 af'al of af'alul qalb, these verbs of the heart, right? But then there's a discussion, right? That he says that, so Al-Faki gives a nice explanation, right? He says, وَلَمَّا كَانَ بَعْضُ الْأَفْعَالِ الْمَذْكُورَ مِنْهَا ما يستعمل لليقين ومع ذلك لا يتعدى إلى مفعولين أشار إلى الاحتراز عن ذلك, right? He says that even though, so the commentator explains that even though some of these af'al are used for certitude, but they are not sometimes taking two maf'uls. And he explains that إذا كانت ظن بمعنى اتهم ورأى بمعنى أبصر وعلم بمعنى عرف لم تتعدى إلا إلى مفعول واحد نحو ظننت زيدا بمعنى اتهمته ورأيت زيدا بمعنى أبصرته وعلمت المسألة يعني عرفتها علمت right? So in some cases these don't take they take a meaning other than, so if dhanna, that takes the meaning of ittahama, of accuse, right? Or suspecting. Ittahama is to ittahama, what's the form of ittahama? Iftahala is to engage in tuhma of another, right? Of suspecting or doubting or casting the suspicion or doubt, which is accusing. Yani, So if dhanna has the meaning of ittahama, or ra'a has the meaning of absara, because ra'i is ra'yul qalb and ra'yul ayn. Ra'yul qalb is from af'al al-qalb. Right? So let's say Sidi Zain was doing some transcript and did a really good job, but there's a lot of edits. So he says, Ra'aytul amra sa'ban. Right? What kind of ra'i is this? Ra'yul qalb. But if you say, Ra'aytul qahwata, this is not af'al al-qalb, because here ra'i had bima'na absara. Right? So it doesn't behave like this. وَعَلِمَ بِمَعْنَ عَرَفَ. I came to know him. Right? Right? It doesn't take two maf'uls in this case, right? Right? So in these cases, they don't behave, right, in that manner, right? Right? So رأيت زيدا بمعنى أبصرته. علمت المسألة يعني عرفتها. Okay? And there's other examples, right? And wajada also has other meanings as well. The commentator explains some of these, right? 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 That wajada has meaning of finding. It was the action of the heart. Right? It also means hazina, to be sorrowed, or haqid, or hiqd, right? What? So you say wajada Zaydun, Zayd felt pain, right? You can just take one. Wajada Zaydun, Zayd found, meaning Zayd experienced. I.e., what meant by it is alaman. Alaman or huznan. But those are rare, like don't dabble in them. Okay, the second kind is af'alul tasir, the af'al of transforming, so to speak, right? These behave like dhanna, so they're from dhanna and akhawatuha. So there's af'al al-qalb and af'al al-tasir. Right? And they indicate, and they're called af'al al-tasir, of transformation. Again, the Mutammima is meant to be this bridge, right? As he says in the beginning, right? That's why the muqaddimat of books are important, right? So they equip us with a framework, but that framework needs unpacking, right? Which is why you need the mid-level works, right? So he didn't define for us what are the af'al al-qalb, why they call af'al al-qalb. He doesn't give us a definition of af'al al-tasir. Why? Because if he unpacks all of that, then you'll never get beyond this text, right? Right? Because it has the meaning of transformation, right? Of tahwil. لدلالته لتحويل شيء من حالة إلى حالة أخرى. Right? Of changing one thing from one state to another. Right? So النوع الثاني أفعال التصير نحو جعل ورد واتخذ وصير ووهب. Right? Is that correct? Yep. So how many are there? 5. Right? Now, what does he say? That when he says here, Nahu, it indicates that the af'al al-tasir are more than this, right? Right? And if you prepared for the class, you'd also notice that ja'ala, where did ja'ala come before this? Where did ja'ala come? Scroll up or go back in your text. Yeah, it's one of the af'al al-qulub, right? Right? Zamtu wa ja'altu wa hajawtu. Right? So ja'ala can come as one of the af'al al-qulub, and it can also come as one of the af'al al-tasir. It behaves like dhanna in either case, but for a different meaning. One is because it is a judgment, it's an action of the heart. The other is of the meaning of tasir, of transforming something, right? So, قال الله تعالى فجعلناه هباء منثورا. Right? Right? فجعلناه هباء منثورا. Right? فجعلناه هباء منثورا. Right? هباء. Right? So فجعلناه, فجعلنا فعل فاعل, the ها جعلناه is مفعول أول, and هباء is مفعول ثاني, and منثورة is صفة for صفة نعت for هباء, right? So it has a meaning. جعلناه, we made it, right? 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 Has a meaning of transformation, right? مبتدأ and خبر outside of the context of relation be هو هباء منثور. But جعلناه هباء منثورا, it was something else. فصيرناه, okay? It was transformed to this. That's what it's called أفعال التصير. وقال تعالى, and this is what's called nawasikh, because if you say huwa haba'un manthur, you're talking about its state now. But you put ja'ala in it, that we transform it from something else to something else, right? Okay. وقال تعالى لو يردونكم من بعد إيمانكم كفارا والعياذ بالله. Right? If they could turn you after your faith into disbelievers. Right? So radda is one of the af'al al-sayrura, to take from one state to another. But radda is to take back. Right? To take away. And اتخذ الله إبراهيم خليلا. Right? So اتخذ فعل, لفظ الجلالة فاعل, إبراهيم خليلا. Right? The statement on its own من مبتدأ خبر outside of revelation would be إبراهيم خليل. Right? But اتخذ الله إبراهيم خليلا. Allah took Ibrahim as a Khalil. Because it's in istifa min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So Ibrahim مفعول أول, Khalil مفعول ثاني. right? وَنَحُ صَيَّرْتُ الطِّينَ خَزَفًا. I transform the mud into khazaf. What is khazaf? What is khazaf?
Pottery.
Khazaf is like dried clay, right? It doesn't have to be actual pottery, but good. There's living people, alhamdulillah. Huh? Okay. You can hit yourself 6 times. 3 for each one. Okay. وقالوا حبني الله فداءك. Okay. عفوا وهبني الله فداءك. Right? And this is rare. وهبني الله فداءك. This is قليل. وهبني وهب أنا. Right? So لفظ الجلالة is فاعل. وهب is the فعل of the سيرورة here. أفعال التصير. وهب is فعل. ني, so the ياء المتكلم is مفعول أول. فداءك is the مفعول الثاني. وهبني الله فداءك. Allah gifted me your fida. Right? What is fida? What is fida?
Redemption.
Yeah. Well, fida is very interesting because fida has redemption or your saving. Fida is what you sacrifice, right? Fidaka ummi wa abi, they say. You know, it's sort of could use also, it's the ransom. There's redemption, ransom, what you would sacrifice. So it's a fascinating word, right? Avdika bi ruhi wa dami. The poets say it all the time. Right? Right? Hear that? Right? 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 And it's used in Ghazal a lot because the poets like, أفديك بروحي ودمي. I would, I'd give for you my soul and my blood. Right? Anyways, that's outside the scope of. But it's fida is. Okay. So these are the 2 types of af'al of dhanna. Then he tells us the ahkam. Right? Of dhanna and akhawatuha. Right? We try to share a brief summary of these. Right? So he says, wa'alam. Right? And yeah, wa'alam, this is used for tanbih. And know, right? Very often this is one of the adat of tanbih. Right? Right? I mean, rhetorically, it's not adat bima'na al-nahwi, right? But it's used for tanbih, rhetorically, right? To give, pay attention, right? No, because now he's going from listing what they are and their examples, so now he's going to give rulings, right? So also used sometimes for iltifat, right? To turn from one thing to another. It says, واعلم أن أفعال الباب يعني أن الأفعال أن لأفعال هذا الباب ثلاثة أحكام. الأول الإعمال وهو الأصل وهو واقع في الجميع. The first is that they act. إعمال. And this affects all of them. Right? Right? And there's some detail in the commentary because the af'al that come in this chapter are jamid and mutasarrif, al-qalbi and tasiri. Right? But so here, if you're being diligent, fakihi, for example, and don't go into al-ahdal here, but al-fakihi breaks down the af'al of qalb a little more. One thing to do is to note that, right? 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 And not take notes initially on it because it's an extra detail. Taqsim of dhanna wa akhawatuha. Right? So you make a note that they're here and then you come later and you diagram them. Okay? So we won't unpack that, right? But it's there. الثاني الإلغاء. The second is when it doesn't act. So acting, and then second is not acting. Right? وهو إبطال العمل لفظا ومحلا لضعف العامل. Right? The second is for it not to behave, is not to do its role both in wording and in place. لضعف العامل. Now, this is one of the possible critiques, right, of the Mutammima, right? That sometimes he brings in the reasoning, and the basis is that the reasoning, where does it belong? In the commentaries. That you give the masail and their amthila in the matan and the ta'leel, right? And the tawdih in the sharh. Right? But the counter argument, it's his text, he can do whatever he wants with it, right? Right? And especially if it doesn't distract or take too much time, right? But it's good to notice these things, but there's a wajh, right? Because and one of the reasons he'd mentioned this, because this reasoning is the basis of the taqsim. Why? Al-ilgha, that it doesn't act. إبطال العمل لفظا ومحلا لضعف العامل. Why is it ضعف العامل? Because the عامل ظن أخواتها becomes weak بتوسطه أو تأخره, because it falls بتوسطه أي بين المبتدأ والخبر. It falls between the مبتدأ and the خبر, أو تأخره, or it falls after the مبتدأ and خبر. Right? نحو ظننت قائم زيد ظننت قائم. This is توسط. Right? ظننت here falls between زيد and قائم. Or تأخر زيد قائم ظننت. Right? Right? And here, if you toil, there's other examples given by Fakihi. Okay. Now this ilgha, is it wajib or not? He explains, right? وهو meaning al-ilgha, right? جائز لا واجب وإلغاء المتأخر أقوى من إعماله والمتوسط بالعكس. Right? So المتوسط يعني إعماله أقوى. Right? So إلغاء. So there, the إلغاء happens in ظن أخواته for two reasons, which are توسط and تأخير. إلغاء in the متأخر is أقوى. إلغاء of المتوسط أضعف. Right? So in the متوسط, the أقوى is, the متوسط is when ظن أخواتها come between the مبتدا and the خبر. زيد قائم, زيد ظننت قائم. Right? So in the متوسط, what is أقوى? الإعمال. In the متأخر, زيد قائم ظننت, إلغاء is أقوى. Correct? Good. لا يجوز إلغاء العامل المتقدم. But it is not permitted, grammatically, not شرعا, right, to لا يجوز إلغاء العامل المتقدم. When the عامل comes before the مبتدأ and the خبر, right, ظننت زيدا قائما, you can't say ظننت زيد قائم. Right? Right? There is some argument about some of this. Right? The issue of the متوسط, right, that المتوسط إعماله أقوى من إلغائه, and that's what's mentioned in the توضيح. Right? توضيح, by التوضيح in the books of grammar they refer to أوضح المسالك of Ibn Hisham. Right? And this is an issue where Ibn Hisham himself, right, وقيل يعني الإلغاء والإعمال مع التوسط على حد سواء, that you can do both إعمال and إلغاء equally, right, and explains why, and that's what he took in قطر الندى. Right? So there's agreement that so if there's توسط or تأخر, the إلغاء is جائز. In تأخر, إلغاء is أقوى. In توسط, إعمال is أقوى. Right? According to the position here, على خلاف, and the khilaf is very intriguing. Ibn Hisham himself has تردد between أوضح المسالك and شرح القطر. شرح القطر has been served by many others as well, like قطر الندى itself. So شرح القطر has multiple حواشي on it, amongst them al-Alusi and al-Sibai and others. And al-Fakihi himself has a beautiful commentary on the matan of قطر الندى. It's called Mujib al-Nida, and there's a brilliant hashi on it by Yasin al-Himsi, I think, Hashiyat Yasin. And al-Khatib al-Shirbini has a sharh on قطر الندى. And it's very nice. ولا يجوز إلغاء العامل المتقدم نحو ظننت زيدا قائما خلافا للكوفيين, contrary to the Kufis. Right? 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 And so that's the second. So there's i'mal. Number 2 is ilgha. So we took ilgha. The third case is التعليق. Right? التعليق, which is وهو إبطال العمل لفظا لا محلا. Right? التعليق, making it and right, that outwardly it doesn't perform the function of ظن أخواتها, right? So you don't see the nasab, but محلا it's mansub, right? And this إبطال العمل لفظا is wajib, right? لا محلا, right? And what's the reasoning behind it? لمجيء ما له صدر الكلام بعده. And this, again, he gives a ta'leel, but this is a very useful ta'leel because it clarifies the issue. Because لمجيء ما له صدر الكلام بعده, because after this comes that whose normal place is the beginning of a sentence, right? And these are these 6 things, right? لام الابتداء, ما النافية, لا النافية, إن النافية, همزة الاستفهام, or if either مفعول is اسم استفهام. In each of these cases, these all belong at the beginning of a sentence, right? And ظن and أخواتها enter upon what? Into the mubtada and khabar, right? So each of these, the mubtada and khabar takes lamul ibtida, takes each of these things, right? So there's, if you put like brackets, there's a mubtada and khabar. There are things that belong at the beginning of a sentence, right? If they come and then before them comes ظن أخواتها, these strengthen the bond, as it were, the bond of, because of their connection to the mubtada and khabar. In wording, it stays like the mubtada and khabar, right? So you have mubtada and khabar, you have these things that belong at the beginning of the mubtada and khabar, and they all, as you see, strengthen the bond between the mubtada and the khabar. لام الابتداء, لزيد قائم, right? This لام الابتداء strengthens the bond between زيد and قائم. ما زيد, ما هؤلاء ينطقون, right? ما نافية, لا نافية, إن النافية, right? Or إن النافية, همزة الاستفهام, etc. They strengthen that bond, right? So lafzan, what happens? Dhanna comes into it. Lafzan, the mubtada and khabar stay in. Lafzan in rafa, but the mahal, because of the presence of dhanna wa khawatuha, is nasb. Right? That's a simplified explanation. There's underlying mechanics of it, but we don't need to unpack them right now. They come. Right? So what are they? وهو لام الابتداء نحو ظننت لزيد قائم. Right? So you say جملة of زيد قائم في محل نصب, right? معلق عنها, right? right? العامل في اللفظ بلام الابتداء, because لام الابتداء has صدر الكلام, right? So and there's different interpretations of why this happens. This is how the Arabs spoke, but it's understood, right? He gives two explanations. The first one appears to be the stronger one. Okay. The second example is ما النافية كقوله تعالى لقد علمت ما هؤلاء ينطقون, right? Right? From Surah Al-Anbiya. And لا النافية, and this is right? And this is in a particular context, so don't use them on your own, right? This is in Jawab al-Qasam, right? As mentioned explicitly in several of the works of Ibn Hisham, right? So وعلم يعني علمت لا زيد قائم ولا عمرو, right? So it's an implicit قسم here. لا زيد قائم ولا عمرو. That there's a والله, this علمت is في جواب قسم, right? As if there is an implicit والله, right? Of course, a point to note from Fakihi is his frequent reference to the works of Ibn Hisham, right? And inshallah, after this you'll be on a Ibn Hisham journey, in that the normal order is to, after this, is to do Sharh Qatr al-Nada, then Sharh Shudhur al-Dhahab. You would also do well to do Sharh Qawaid al-I'rab. Qawaid al-I'rab itself is by Ibn Hisham. The Sharh normally covered on that is Shaykh Khalid al-Azhari's. And then, when people get to the Alfiya, sometimes they do a shorter commentary on the Alfiya, then Awdah al-Masalik, or they jump straight into Awdah al-Masalik. So basically, and then after that they do Mughni al-Labib. So the whole journey, it's like once you leave the Ajrumiyya, so the Arab curriculum basically is take Ibn Hisham's hand and he'll take you, from Qatr al-Nada, from drops of dews, to Shudhur al-Dhahab, to nuggets of gold. Then he takes you to on Awdah al-Masalik, on the clearest of pathways, although people call it A'war al-Masalik, the most crooked of ways. It's a challenging work if someone does it properly. And then to Mughni al-Labib, sufficiency for the smart, An Kalam al-A'arib. But one should make the intention of doing that whole journey properly, and we'll hand you over to someone who can take you on that journey, inshallah. Okay. In النافية نحو علمت إن زيد قائم, right? This is an in. Again, this is also in jawab of qasam. علمت إن زيد قائم, as if you're saying in والله زيد قائم, right? So this is in, this is a negative in, and there's an implicit qasam in it, right? So these are not things to say normally, right? Because it's not how people normally speak, right? وهمزة الاستفهام نحو علمت أزيد قائم أم عمرو, right? Right? علمت زيد قائم أم عمرو. وكون أحد المفعولين اسم استفهام. علمت أيهم أبوك. Right? Right? So, here, one of the maf'uls, أيهم, is اسم استفهام, so it doesn't behave. Right? So he says, فالتعليق واجب إذا وجد شيء من هذه المعلقات. If any of these things take place, and they are, as we see, of these, the first, لام الابتداء, is more common. The others are more rare, with degrees of rareness, right? But don't run experiments on any of these, right? And some of you are more susceptible temperamentally to these kinds of experiments. Don't. It's better to be right than smart. فالتعليق واجب إذا وجد شيء من هذه المعلقات أو معلقات. ولا يدخل التعليق ولا الإلغاء في شيء من أفعال التصير. So the أفعال التصير only take إعمال. إلغاء and تعليق only occur to أفعال القلوب. ولا في قلبي جامد, nor in the فعل قلبي that is جامد. And the فعل قلبي جامد. Now, what is a فعل جامد? Right? Right? What is a فعل جامد, folks? We'll give a moment for responses to come through. الجامد, a very simple way, is ما لا يتصرف, right? It has one form, right? And we just leave it at that level, right? 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 And الفرق between the فعل الجامد والفعل المتصرف, this is something that when you come to something like this, you should, it should stir a basic lookup impulse in the طالب علم, right? So the jamid is ما لا يتصرف. It doesn't take the tasrif and it doesn't take the various forms. It has one form, and the وهو اثنان هب, which is وهب and تعلم, فإنهما متلازمان صيغة الأمر, هب and تعلم, وما أعداهما من أفعال الباب متصرف. And the rest of the أفعال are متصرف, يأتي منه المضارع والأمر وغيرهما, right? So he gives a descriptive definition of the what is a فعل متصرف, but it's a descriptive definition, but it's good, right? So the جامد ما لا, الجامد ما لا يتصرف بمعنى أنه يلزم صيغة واحدة. المتصرف ما يقبل التصريف بمعنى أنه يأتي منه الماضي والمضارع والأمر عادة, right? إلا هب من أفعال التصير فإنه ملازم لصيغة الماضي um, um, والاتصال فيهن ما ثبت لهن ما تقدم من الأحكام. Right? ويثبت لتصاريفهن. Right? Some copies don't say, have this ويثبت, and this is needed. Right? ويثبت. Right? So for example, some copies of Matan don't have this. ويثبت لتصاريفهن ما ثبت لهن مما تقدم من الأحكام. And the various forms, ما ظن يظن, etc. The various forms of them take the same rulings, and some examples came in the examples given. ويجوز حذف المفعولين أو أحدهما لدليل. One or both maf'uls can be omitted in ظن وأخواتها if there is an indicator. أين الشركاء نحو قوله تعالى أين شركائي الذين كنتم تزعمون. Where are my partners that you used to imagine? تزعمون أي تزعمونهم شركاء. So here تزعمون is زعم is من باب ظن. يأخذ مفعولين. Where are the maf'uls? Both are محذوف because they're known from what? Before. تزعمون أي تزعمونهم شركاء. That is part of the power of the Arabic language, right? That very often, one of the ways of eloquence is not to say it. بالسياق, بالمفهوم. That's from the power of the language, right? And that's not a matter of interpretation, right? Someone who says this, what does it mean? كنتم تزعمون ما معناه? This is not tafsir. This is not istinbat, right? This is مفهوم من الكلام. And that's the difference between the mafhum, right, and al-istinbat. Al-mafhum is taken from the text itself directly, right? Istinbat, what is interpreted out, istanbata, that's why istinbat, which is a legal interpretation, is you dig into the meaning. So the mafhum is a meaning found at, so you go to the well, there's water there already, right? There's ibaratun nas, dilalatun nas, isharatun nas, muqtada nas. That is all there at the surface level. So anyone with sound temperament and sound understanding of the language would get this meaning. Istinbat, derivation of meanings, that is ijtihad, right? But practically, even the more subtle meanings, most people miss them, sadly. وإذا قيل لك من ظننته قائما فتقول ظننت زيدا أي ظننت زيدا قائما. An example of one maf'ul being omitted, right? Right? من ظننته قائما, you say ظننت زيدا أي ظننت زيدا قائما. And then he just tells us about سمعت وعد صاحب الآجرمية من هذه الأفعال. سمعت تبعا للأخفش رحمه الله تعالى ومن وافقه. Okay, there's a number of and don't go into these kinds of khilafiyat, right? Usefully, of course, here there's a number of examples given by al-Fakihi for that highlight this hadf. But then, so he considered سمعت تبعا للأخفش ومن وافقه ولا بد أن يكون مفعولها الثاني جملة مما يسمع نحو سمعت زيدا يقول كذا ونحو قوله تعالى سمعنا فتى يذكرهم. Right? So they said سمع is from ظن وأخواتها, and the second maf'ul has to be a jumla that is audible. Right? But there's an ishkal. Right? One is that sami'a is not a fi'l qalbi. Like just in terms of the taqseem, would be khilaf al-asl. Right? Is sami'a min af'al al-qalb? Well, the argument is, well, sort of, right? Right? Because what do you hear with? Do you hear with your ears? What words come through your ears? But where does the meaning that is heard arise? In the heart. So this is a fascinating issue, right? Like, you hear sounds, الفاظ الكلام هو اللفظ المركب المفيد بالوضع, right? What the ears, what do they hear? ألفاظ مركبة, right? المفيد أي مع يعني فائدة يحسن السكوت عندها. Where does the فائدة take place? Anyone? The قلب. Right? You hear sounds. Where do you understand from? Like, do you see with your eyes? And so you could argue that you hear sounds with your ears, but the meanings are from the qalb. Of course, the refutation is, but then same thing happens to the eyes, and then we don't say ra'a, بمعنى أبصر is not from أفعال القلب, right? So that's why there's refutation. But it is not some baseless argument, right? This has, like it belonging with the أفعال القلب has an argument, but there is a counter argument, and one could investigate that in its due place, right? ومذهب الجمهور أنها فعل متعد إلى واحد. The majority said that سمع takes one مفعول. فإن كان معرفة كالمثال الأول فالجملة التي بعده حال. Right? If it's definite, like the example given, سمعت زيدا, the جملة after is يقول, أي حال قوله. Right? وإن كان نكرة كما في الآية سمعنا فتى فالجملة بعده صفة. Right? And this goes back to a principle regarding the جمل, يعني بعد المعارف أحوال, والجمل بعد النكرات صفات. And this is غالبا, right? Right? So that, and then he says, Wallahu a'lam. Right? Right? So, and that's, so sami'a is not from this, and it's a fi'l, So it doesn't لا ينصب مفعولين بل يتعدى إلى مفعول واحد. Right? And afterwards إن كان معرفة كالمثال الأول فالجملة بعده فالجملة التي بعده is what? حال. Right? And there's a principle there that الجملة بعد المعارف الجمل بعد المعارف are أحوال. Right? لأن الجملة بعد المعارف أحوال. And if إن كانت الجملة التي بعده نكرة إن كانت نكرة كما في الآية يعني سمعنا فتى يذكرهم. فتى is نكرة فالجملة صفة because the principle is لأن الجمل بعد النكرات صفات. And this is useful. Right? And then he goes into باب المنصوبات من الأسماء. So we'll read this and stop. باب المنصوبات من الأسماء. المنصوبات 15 وهي المفعول به ومنه المنادى كما سيأتي بيانه والمصدر ويسمى المفعول المطلق وظرف الزمان وظرف المكان ويسمى مفعولا فيه والمفعول لأجله والمفعول معه والمشبه بالمفعول به والحال والتمييز والمثنى وخبر كان وأخواتها خبر كان وأخواتها. Right? وخبر الحروف المشبهة بليس خبر أفعال المقاربة واسم إن وأخواتها واسم لا التي لنفي الجنس والتابع للمنصوب وهو 4 أشياء كما تقدم. So he says المفعول به. And here please come prepared because in the مفعول به there is a curveball which is باب الاشتغال. Right? So, if we get a sense that, people weren't ready for this, we'll just stop it there. So please be prepared for this because the باب الاشتغال needs preparation. So we have the مفعول به and the منصوبات are overall very straightforward. There's just some things, but اشتغال needs you need to be prepared for it. And the munada, right, also has nuance and it's very important because the nida is powerful. So we will, right, and right, so the maf'ul bihi is very straightforward, right? The maf'ul bihi is ظاهر and mudmar, right? And the basis of maf'ul is that is متأخر عن الفاعل, but قد يتقدم either جوازا or وجوبا, right? Right? And then باب الاشتغال is it's not it's not difficult, but it needs being prepared before to catch it. There's only a couple of ahkam related to it, right? But it's one of the things, like these are the tests of having covered the Mutammima, right? That these abhath al-Mutammima, if you don't know them, you haven't studied the Mutammima, right? And then the Munada, again, people live their whole life, or they go through all of Nahw and they don't know Munada, they don't know Istithna, right? So, and it's not that difficult, right? I mean, it's not that simplistic because there's 5 types of Munada, right? There's 5 types of Munada and they take 2 rulings, right? That's all that there's to the Munada, and then there's Fawaid in the Munada, right? So, so that's just a little guidance to what's coming. We'll stop there. Wa sallallahu ala al-Habib al-Mustafa. وآله وصحبه ذوي الوفا والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions before we run away? Temper.
See, I have a question. What are some Mutammima or Fawakih level commentaries of the Ajrumiyya? And how are the commentaries of Shirbini and al-Azhari?
Sorry. Mutammima level commentaries of the Ajrumiyya.
Or Fawakih level.
That's a good question. One is the طالب العلم لا يبخل بالكتب, right? Right? من أسباب نيل العلم الكتب, right? But of course selectively, so you should have a good selection of the key books. هذا لا بد منه, right? Of these, you know, the Sharh of Zaini Dahlan is very brief, but the Sharh of Zaini Dahlan has a number of hawashi on it, right? That's been given a lot of attention to, right? The Sharh of Shaykh Khalid al-Azhari has a few hawashi on it. These are two simple shuruh, but they've had a lot of inaya, right? Shaykh Khalid al-Azhari and Shaykh Zaini Dahlan. Shaykh Zaini Dahlan, of course, played a very important historical role in, you know, with respect to the fitna of the Wahhabis, and he has some, yeah, and they don't particularly like him, of course, to say the least. But he's, you know, him and his the family of scholarship too. There's some important things there. So there's a few hawashi on them. Kafrawi, of course, is is very beneficial. And you know, we read it with Sheikh Abdurrahman Kharsa. Kafrawi is very beneficial. Also, Maulana Ibn al-Ashmawi, which we read with Sheikh Talal and covered it afterwards as well. That's extremely beneficial. Ibn al-Ashmawi. Al-Khatib al-Shirbini's sharh is very clear. Almost like doesn't need, like, you know, it's very clear, but has good examples, very good principles, and he's someone to, you know, and he's a very Mubarak scholar. I mean, the author of Mughni al-Muhtaj in Shafi'i fiqh. His commentary on that, on the Ajrumiyya, on Tasrif al-Izzi, on Qatr al-Nada, his commentary on the Alfiyya, they're all very clear and they're very useful. Sheikh Ali's short and large shuruh on the Ajrumiyya are excellent and very, very useful. All these one should have, right? And you know, Tashwiq al-Khillan, it's way over the top in terms of something one would read, right? Way over the top, right? But the useful thing is that on any issue, if you want to just unpack, okay, what's going on here? It'll blow up the issue very, very clearly. Right? But don't get lost in it, because it's, you know, actually I checked, it's more than twice the length of some of the commentaries on the Alfiyya, right? And thank God there's the modern print that I have is a cheapo print, So it's only in 500 pages. It was done in a fancy print, with adding footnotes to the hashia. It would have been easily 1,000 pages. So those are some of the works. Of course, so much has been on the Ajrumiyya, right? But also, one doesn't want to be stuck. It's all it's important, and there's some things that, having done, like we've done the Ajrumiyya, we've done the Tuhfa, we're getting through the we're getting through to the next text. So the Mutammima, we get to Sharh Qatr al-Nada. It's important to move forward, and it's important to build, right? But one can comfortably, one should aim that any one text one covers, one should have studied at least, on one's own, at least one text per text that one has studied. That's Shaykh Muhammad Jum'ah's advice. That's al-aqal, that's the least, right? Because also at the Ajrumiyya level, you have a durusun nahwiyya, right? Which are, which are very useful. Book 1 and 2, which are sort of foundation. They're Ajrumiyya level, and they have the third book, I think, the third or fourth book in the series. I think book 1 and 2, or book 1, 2, and 3 are sort of Ajrumiyya and Sharh al-Ajrumiyya level, and there's the third level book, or maybe the fourth, I think third level book, which is standalone, and also a very good summary of sarf and some bahith of balagha, etc. Then you have Jami' al-Durus al-Arabiyya of al-Ghalayini, which is really, really good, right? There's the other one, al-Nahw al-Wadih, which I hate passionately, but some people believe in it because of the examples. There's a Nahw al-Tadbiqi, which Shaykh Ali loves and I hate because it's all examples. But I would defer to, I might not defer to him on that one, but because it dumbs people down. But people also like al-Balagh al-Wadih. I hate al-Balagh al-Wadih with a passion, even though I covered it with Shaykh Adib, but hate it. But it's there. Right, and there's a lot of other small rasail, etc. There's not, and there's, but it's important. The first thing one focuses on is the text one studying oneself, right? That is your fard and your nafil, right? That's your fard and the sunnah mu'akkada, right? Is master that text. Then the reading next to it should be guided. One should have a plan. One discusses with one's teacher or teachers that, okay, what should I do to prepare for this class, to understand this class? How should I prepare from it? Because it's easy to go into the weeds and get lost. And without exaggeration, a friend of mine, at one point, his intention was that he wanted to get further ahead in his Shafi'i fiqh than his teacher, Shaykh Amjad Rashid. But then he started, when he's supposed to do the Mutammima, he started studying. He started just reading al-Kawakib Durriya, cover to cover, for each class. And they're doing the Mutammima 4 days a week. He got so overwhelmed by the Kawakib Durriya that he cancelled his lesson. And actually, it was one of the triggers. And now, every 2 or 3 years now, he laments to me that, it's been years since I've opened my books. My Shafi'i books have been in storage, I think now 8, 9, 10 years. I've only taken, once in a while he takes one book out and sort of asks, what do you think if I memorized the Zubad, whatever, and just stagnated, right? Because لَن يُشَادَّ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ, right? And this applies to the deen and applies to أي أعمال من أعمال الدين, and it applies بالمفهوم to just it's a principle of life, right? وَإِنْ شَاءَ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ, right? A-deen, it's not the whole religion, it's the religion, or any أي عمل ديني, right? That's understood from that, and then the isharat that nas applies as a principle of life. ولن يشاد الدين ولن يشاد شيئا أحد إلا غلبه. Right? So there's a lot of other things that one could do at any one level, but the focus has to be on you master what you have, do something else that helps you with mastery, like with the Ajrumiyya. You'll be hard pressed to find more precise definitions as you go through than you find in al-Ashmawi, for example, right? Right? Al-Ashmawi is beautiful. And so, those are things that one does on one's own, right? One does that, finds fawaid, many texts, but even other texts one does to review them. Like, if you've done, alhamdulillah, we got to do al-Awamil, but we, to review the Awamil, read one of the, go through one of the commentaries, at least catch fawaid from the commentary, write it out a second time, diagram it, re-diagram it, etc. So you retain these things. If you memorize a poem related to the Awamil, you review that, say, okay, is there a way I could listen to, that's, like Shaykh Ahmad Saad's poem on the Awamil is actually a poem version of which commentary? Of which text? The Awamil of al-Jurjani. No one would get hurt by reading the Awamil of al-Jurjani on their own. Right? Find out what's a good, clear, like a sharh tawdihi, not a sharh tahqiqi, and sort of, and those are all things that one does on his own, and that expands. Right? But in a guided manner without losing priority on other subjects. Right? So we'll stop there, inshallah. We'll start the next class at 5:30. We need a few minutes.